Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to Draulon Joe Talk CSGO. First episode, we'll call this a spiritual successor to Stitch and Joe Talk CSGO, my personal favorite podcast that was taken from us too soon. Joining us are Balaj Lengel, Draulon. He's a content creator, specifically with Unicorn, and a shameless heroic fanboy, even though Valde has left them. And then obviously in between both of us, we have none other than Duncan Thorin Shields. You will all know him from his savage Twitter and his personality on many a talent desk. So how are you guys doing today? Or tonight in your guys' cases?
Duncan, go ahead.
Seems fine. I'm alive. Any not really that interesting a question, really, is it? So skip over that to some CS.
All right.
Yep. Should we get right into it then?
Absolutely, go for it.
All right. So Duncan, let's start with a topic which I know is close to your heart: the Brazilian scene. Now, let's not talk about the whole Immortals breaking up fiasco, because everyone knows about that by now. What I would like to ask you is that it looks like the decision is that Immortals would like to rebuild a team around the core of Steel, boltz, and Zach. And do you think that that is the correct decision to make? Like, is there still room to build a squad for Immortals that kind of rivals the skill level of the previous one?
I think it's probably not possible to build one that's as good as the previous one, because they all. I actually feel like this is why. It sounds bizarre, but I actually kind of secretly hope SK breaks up, because I actually feel like that type of team has to be as good as they were in the summer. Otherwise, they're actually kind of hoarding talent. Like, it's kind of fucked up if your third best player is like Phelps, who probably should be a star player on any other team, So I feel like either the SK team should really work out and they should be like the best team of the whole year and the ultimate team, in which case, fair enough, you can't blame them for wanting all the good players. Or they should just actually let some of those fucking good players go. If Fur doesn't want to play anymore, if Phelps wants to go back, let's get one of those players. Then you can start building a team in the Immortal squad that can also contend and can also be very good. Because at the moment, like, it's pretty obvious that this was the only option that they had. Like, there's no kind of option for any kind of professional organization to say they're going to go the other way and build around Henny and Lucas One and KNG in that way. So it's not their fault they had to lose their players, but I'd have to say, looking at the people that even the people they were potentially getting, okay, some of those people had some talent and actually aren't as bad as the unknown status of their names might seem, but they haven't even got those people. So the names that it seems like they are adding at the moment look pretty lackluster. And I actually also kind of have a suspicion myself that the reason why they haven't just gone ahead and announced 3 of them and said we've got that fully active roster is I actually feel as though they might actually be waiting on the SK thing to see if there's going to be anyone pushed out from SK. Because at this point in time, any of those players get pushed out, you'll figure a way to make them work in your team.
Yeah, because the reason I'm asking is that obviously the other option for Immortals would be to see if they can get boltz or steel perhaps into SK Gaming, because in the end that is kind of like the final destination for all Brazilian players. As skilled as the Immortals lineup was, it's still like a spot on SK Gaming is still more prestigious. So what I want to ask is that, do you think, for example, boltz, who is clearly like a contender to joining SK, would he perhaps be willing to undergo yet another we build up another team and then the whole process of that?
I mean, it feels like at the moment part of the issue is that he's pretty clearly an Immortals player, and who knows when their contracts were signed at this point in time, but if the org's willing to build around you, you have to be committed to some degree. So I don't even know whether it will be feasible, as in whether it would be a large buyout, something along those lines. And then there's also the fact that one of the really tricky things if you're an outsider looking in on teams is a lot of really good players are very stubborn. And there's a logic as to why they are. Like, for example, if they're better than someone and they consistently think they're better than someone, then that's part of their confidence, as they believe that they're better than that player. But as a result, it's really tough to change the minds of players who played with you in the past or have beaten you, that you're good enough to be in their team or to replace another of their teammates. And so the fact that Immortals not only were worse than SK overall, but almost never used to beat SK. I also think plays really badly into the favor of anyone who used to be in the SK Luminosity squads and was kicked out, getting a chance to come back. Because I don't know if the SK guys actually appreciate what the rest of us do, which is how much boltz has improved as like a great performer in tough situations, how much steel's changed as a player. I don't know if they actually have the same appreciation for that, or whether they just think it's because they play at a lower level. So I certainly think someone like boltz should be a top contender if there's going to be any kind of push out from SK. He should certainly be someone you're considering. Could probably do a lot for the team, but I don't really know whether actually the SK side of the equation would really, if they have any interest in that at all.
Yeah, and I mean, and speaking of the kind of ex Luminosity, ex Keatstar guys, obviously it's looking like Immortals are looking to add ZQK, which kind of seems more like a marriage of convenience since he was in North America already. So that kind of just seems like it has worked out for them. But he certainly doesn't seem like he would be a candidate to work his way back up to SK at this point in time, and probably ever. There was some personality and behind the scenes issues there as well. So yeah, I agree with you that it can be very difficult if kind of they've already had their shot at kind of like the top level, right, with Fallen and Fur, and
sure.
I agree that it would be kind of hard to get them to kind of go back on that initial decision to get rid of them way back when.
Like, put it this way, it would be different if they'd have also, like, let's say at the major they'd have made the final, but they'd have done so by beating SK. Now that's a different story, you know. That could change everything for you, and suddenly players look at you differently. But I think it's doubly a problem for them. That not only did they get kicked out of those teams, but then, despite to the rest of us, they've improved and done great things. To the people in SK, it's like, well, you haven't, you know.
Yeah.
And the thing is with SK Gaming is that if you look at their results, like the last time they reached a grand final was at Cologne, and I think that was back in July. So now obviously the main excuse which comes up, people usually say, oh, you know, the scene is evolving, it's like harder to like beat, I mean, it's easier for the top teams to beat each other now, and it's like, it's much more competitive at the top. But is that really an excuse right now? Because it's clear that SK Gaming is losing more games than during the summer. So do you think like a change is going to happen?
I do think a change is going to happen, because this sort of team has never actually been this bad. Like, they had those 2 tournaments when they first got Phelps, but it's also like was within the first 3 tournaments they had him in the lineup. So fair play, you're allowed to have some teething problems, you know. But then after that, they were so good. And then they run into this period where they don't even make the finals, as you said. It's not that they're not winning the tournament, they don't even make the finals anymore. So it gets real tough after you've had like 4 going on 5 tournaments where you've never had the big breakthrough. At that point, you can't really put it down to a small issue. Like, it's not like a tiny tweak that's making your team off. And I also don't buy the angle that, like, oh, it's just because all the other teams have improved and the game's getting so competitive. Because, like, if it wasn't for the fact I don't really know like what fair use laws are, I'd just go and make a video of people saying that constantly throughout every year of CSGO whenever a dominant team falls off. You know, they never seem to acknowledge that it can also be that whoever the dominant team was got worse, and therefore it's easier to beat them. Like if you look at the way SK is playing now, I don't think it takes any. You don't need Team Liquid getting better or FaZe rising up to see that people like Fur have had tournaments where they've just been completely off, or to see that Phelps just doesn't work in the team anymore on certain maps. You know, these aspects might be like exacerbated by a really good team rising up, or some of the other squads like G2 and North doing little tweaks that make them better. But I think if SK was still the SK of the summer, it still wouldn't matter. They'd still make finals, they'd still win some of the tournaments. I don't feel like you can just make it one factor that's causing it.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it was you, Duncan, that tweeted that you kind of wonder what would have happened if Zeus had kind of stuck with SK, or certainly if they just had someone coaching them. Yeah. We've seen them go to Inferno a lot, or at least wind up on Inferno a lot, and it clearly has not been a beneficial move for them recently. We even saw Taco talking about that today, about how their Inferno needs to get better. It's kind of like those macro level things that you really need a coach to come in and smack you on the head, because I mean, Fallen is just doing like so many things within that team that he's bound to miss something sooner or later, right?
Yeah, that's one of the areas as well where I actually really wonder about Fallen, because if you look at all the players that have come into his teams and improved, even if they have a role, it does seem like within that context, one of the things I think he's done a very good job of is sort of empowering those people to be like, right, this is your role, but you're going to have some say in how you do it, and you're going to kind of craft that. So eventually you become so good at this role, you're kind of like a mini leader, but from your role, like you know how to tell people the info you need. And ideally that's going to make you, that's part of the reason I think they're such a great clutch team. Like, yeah, they have some really fucking amazing players, but it also helps if your players kind of they can make decisions themselves. They're not just waiting for someone else to tell them off information what to do. The downside of that, unfortunately, is I feel like a lot of his success has come from like initially putting in a lot of hours for people, getting them in position, and then kind of like, I've got the pieces set up now I'll let them play out. And so that doesn't really suit you to like making a lot of little tweaks all over the place, which is the approach other in-game leaders take, more kind of the more controlling in-game leaders. So I actually see that as kind of a flaw of SK, because I always thought, even when they were at the peak in the summer, they definitely had good tactics, because the base of the team, 4 of the players played in one of the great tactical teams, but they did seem a lot loose. And I think they did play off the fact that they had these 3-star players who were unbelievably good, and they all kind of fit in their roles relative to each other. And so the interplay between them, I don't believe Fallen was calling half of that stuff. I don't think he was telling Fur when to go in and do one of his ridiculous pushes he does that just opens up the entire middle of Mirage or something. I think a lot of that was when Fur wants to do it. So the downside is, if your approach is sort of, I trust these guys to know what's best for them, it's kind of tough to then come in and start saying, right, you switch it up like this. Like, for example, there was a game, I'm trying to think which one it was now. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. It might have been at Mykonos. No, actually, maybe it must surely be ESL1 New York. I believe at ESL1 New York, when they played Inferno against Team Liquid, that was the game where, because they'd already had these problems where Fur had repeatedly had issues on Inferno, so against G2 at Malmo and then against Liquid at Mykonos the week after that, but before New York, I believe this was the game where on CT you could even see that at the B site, it was like they'd told Fur, don't ever go outside this line here. Like, you've been having problems when you push up and you're losing the round, so just don't ever do it. And that in itself wasn't a great approach to take, because you're just putting a weird limitation on what the guy wants to do. And I also feel like in that setting, he then didn't know what to do otherwise. So
move that, yeah.
I don't really know if they're a team that responds well to that kind of coaching, So especially also, yeah, if you're a guy in the game, it's a lot tougher to give that kind of minute detail. Whereas a coach, to some degree, one of the good things about a coach is because he's outside of the game, he could suggest something to a Phelps that in theory doesn't make them think of that information in the context of Fallen. They can just go, well, I'm discussing it with the coach now. It's good to have a level of abstraction sometimes in that sense.
Sure.
Now my question is that, do you think that we can draw a comparison with the Pronax era Fnatic? Because in that team, Pronax relatively let the players do their own thing, be more free, and the whole thing kind of broke down when they started losing, and they didn't really know how to deal with losing because they didn't experience at that level before. So do you think this could be like a similar situation with SK Gaming, where they start losing and then they just can't figure out what we're doing wrong, why aren't we winning?
I do think there's some similarities. Like, for example, one aspect that I find really concerning is I remember that Fnatic team, it's not like they just one day woke up and they were just not good anymore. They were still, like with SK now, in theory, they were still pretty good. They could still beat most teams. They just didn't win the tournament anymore. So it was a gradual decline. And I think actually it's a similar scenario. It's a mixture of some of their players weren't as good or as good at their roles. Like, famously at that point in time, that was when JW literally didn't even buy rifles or AWPs. He used to just main a shotgun. That's not even a meme. Yeah. He used to literally do that and try and play weird off angles. So if that's happening, you can already tell that guy's role and his job within the team is in severe danger. Then you had a couple of other players have some issues, and then you added in, similar to now, other teams have either learned how to play against you or they've made the key roster move that helped them get to a next level. So I think that there is something going on like that. I would hope it doesn't end the same way, though. I would hope, obviously, in this scenario, Fallen's not going to leave. I would hope you can just rebuild again. And I will say, when SK is kind of in their worst moment now, I've given a lot of props to Fallen that one of the reasons I was so impressed when they did have that summer run is that it was a different style of SK. Even though it had 4 of the same players, they played pretty differently to 2016. So if he has to restart all over again and make a third type of iteration of SK and somehow that's going to be successful, then the guy's a genius, because like no one else in history's done that, you know.
And talking about rebuilding and Brazilians, we should also mention, you know, the famous trio of like KNG, Lucas, and Henvan, because they are like kind of out in the wild right now. Obviously, I think Lucas and Henny is still contracted to Immortals, like they are benched, but it's pretty obvious that they are looking to build a team with FNX. And personality issues aside, on paper it can still be a pretty heavy-hitting squad if they get the ball rolling. So do you think that will be a team that will see form on its own, or will the players kind of like mix up in the whole Brazilian soup?
I don't see why they couldn't. Like, here's the thing. Obviously, one thing you should always do in Counter-Strike is you should never judge someone's in-game ability on what you think of them as a person. Like, that's totally irrelevant, you know. There's some players I think are fantastic. I actually know we're idiots. Like, they're not people I respect at all as a human, but they're amazing in the game, so you would never guess that. So I think, yeah, certainly a bunch of those players, including FNX, are good players. They absolutely can play at this level. I do think that they would have a far less significant set of performance than they did with this Immortals squad, because the downside is, I mean, it's funny how sometimes people's character is mirrored in how they play the game, because Steel and boltz were the team play core of that team. Like, yeah, Henny is kind of like the player who I always thought kind of defined the style, because he's so up and down, and that kind of reminds me of how Immortals is. And I guess if you put in the most expensive gun in his hand, he is going to be the one who's going to dictate if you do well or don't. But I think when you put all those players together, first of all, obviously, there's not going to be a great kind of like synergy in terms of personalities. Like, you could also see that team having massive internal issues if things go badly. And then secondly, I think in terms of style of play, they would be even more ludicrously streaky. Like, I could see them being really, really bad and then having some games that are pretty good.
Do you think, because obviously that trio basically, as we currently understand the major rules, would currently hold a spot at the major by virtue of their placing, do you think this could be another opportunity for like an Echo Fox moment for a completely like just new org, or just an org that doesn't have a presence in CS to come in, make a big splash, and just buy their way into a major? Do you think that's likely to happen?
I mean, it's that's an example of where I think people went too far with what they thought personally of these players, because I agree, like, if I'm in charge of an org, I would never touch that squad with a barge pole. Like, obviously there's just the baggage alone is going to be hard to overcome. Like, think about the fact that people, you know, 2 years later were telling JW, like, you're a really terrible person because he elbowed someone 3 years earlier at a tournament, you know. Well, it's going to be worse than that with these players. And then there's obviously the fact that they absolutely could do these things again and haven't really shown any remorse. So in theory, you would think like no org will touch them. But that's not the way it works. Like, the very fact that we've seen Kaylee twice get picked up by these orgs who want to benefit from his name shows that there will always be someone out there where it probably is worth taking on the baggage and potentially getting a major spot, no matter what the consequences are. So the real question is just who it will be. So if that's going to be someone, I would guess there'll be someone out there who'll pay the expenses and a small salary and kind of take a gamble on at least them being in this one major, and then hope you can kind of parlay that into something bigger if it goes decently. I'm almost certain it'll happen. I'm not sure who it'll be, but there'll be someone, I guarantee.
So hear me out. Think of an org that comes from League of Legends, one of your other hobbies, that has had some CS squads, and reputation in the CS world is already in the dumpster.
So its reputation's in the dumpster.
Yeah.
And it's from League of Legends.
Yeah.
I mean, NRG already has a squad. Oh, right, you mean a different thing, right? I mean, Echo Fox is probably one of the only ones. Who else even had a squad who's in LCS at the moment? Because Dignitas already has a team. Who else is even out there?
So I'm thinking of TSM. If I was them, I'd be licking my chops right now to get a major team at a discounted price, right?
Oh, listen, I agree. The money side would make a lot of sense. It's like a quick gamble to come in. It's just that I feel like if you're TSM, that's a really bad hit to the brand to take on these players under these circumstances, you know. And I also do think that a mixture of Impulsive, Derek Trong leaving TSM. He actually was working with the Overwatch squad, but obviously he was the person who was working with the CSGO squad before. A mixture of him leaving, which as far as I know means they have nobody in the org that knows about CS, coupled with how badly it went with this last Sean Gares drama. I actually just get the sense for every time I talk to Reginald that he's just not really into CS. He feels as though he doesn't know the space, and I totally agree with him on this one point, which is right now financially it makes no sense to try and get a good team. Like you have to actually gamble at the moment. You have to try and get a team that currently isn't good, but you hope will become good. There's no point buying in for a top squad because you don't make money from them.
Yep. Correct.
Now, discussing the whole major spot, Joe and I kind of wanted to also bring up the last major, because in a sense it was a very strange major, right? Because like two teams who weren't even supposed to like go be in the grand finals made the grand finals, and could this be like a window for possibly reworking or at least reviewing the whole major circuit? What is your take on this, Duncan?
I mean, I've never really changed opinion. Like, I don't think you should ever have had Legends spots. I don't think it should exist. Like, I would prefer something along the lines of what they have in Dota, where you have a certain amount of invites, so that's the equivalent of a Legends spot, but the invites are given out based on how you perform in the tournaments that lead up to the majors, so the international in the case of Dota. And here's the thing, every now and then you will get an invite where it's borderline, you know, like it could have gone between one of these two teams, you know, they give it to team A, therefore fans of team B are like, this is all corruption, it's all bullshit, it's a fascist police state, like as people always do, right? But the difference is I'd rather have 7 out of the 8 invites be completely bang on and all the teams we know are good than have a scenario where, like, it didn't happen this time luckily, but in theory you could have had some pretty good teams not make it through the qualifier, for example, which doesn't make any sense. Like, for example, let's pick a team who wasn't in great form at the time. So I'll pick G2. Right, G2 was in dodgy enough form that there's a world in which they might not have qualified to the major qualifier. But if you're giving out invites and you're like, right, I can invite 8 teams, there's no one in the world isn't inviting G2. So to me, that's the problem there. Is like, if it's meant to be the World Championship, it's meant to represent the best and the biggest and the brightest. It should be the teams that have kind of showed us they were that through the year, not who just got through one qualifier or just bizarrely, this is the worst aspect to me, retained a slot from earlier, where some of those slots are kind of nonsense. Like, for example, one of the great examples for me was that one where Gambit got their Legends spot at Cologne last year, where they just won the 2 best of 1s. They won against, like, I think it was Dignitas first. Was that who they played first, or was it CLG? I think it was Dignitas, and I think they played Astralis, who had obviously Zonic as a stand-in. And winning those 2 best of 1s got them a Legends spot. And yes, but the next merger rolled around, they were a good team, but they had the Legends spot just from winning 2 best of 1s. That's kind of ludicrous. So first of all, I would just get rid of the major spot scenario in that sense. Just have it based on how you do elsewhere.
One quick thing before we move on to the next. What is your thoughts on just slot ownership belonging to cores of players versus organizations, right? Because obviously you did some work with Gfinity last season, and we've now seen in between seasons where, you know, 3 whole teams have been replaced with arguably worse squads now by virtue of those spots belonging entirely to the organization. Do you have, like, it seems to me that neither of these solutions is very good, but it's hard to come up with something sensible that you can quantify.
Like, the big issue is, I think you've really got, first of all, you've got to separate out, are we talking about like majors or are we talking about leagues? Because if we're talking about leagues, I think it is entirely fair that the league slot is owned by the organization. Like, imagine I'm paying all your salaries, I'm paying you to play in tournaments, I've got you in all these positions, I've provided you with analysts and with coaches, and then you just go, for next season, by the way, this guy's going to pay us $1,000 more, so you don't have a spot anymore, so we're all off. Like, that would be ludicrous, you know. No professional sport could operate that way, because you could never justify building a squad up, basically. Everyone would have to have a mercenary mindset. So for leagues, I think it's absolutely fine for orgs to own the slots, not least because because League players actually one of the only places orgs can start to make back some of that money by having a guaranteed amount of hours that you're going to play and games you're going to play and that they can sell to a sponsor. So I think it's different when it's about majors. In general, the major system works currently, mainly because currently, in theory, kind of works to the benefit of both parties. Like, it's very rare you're just going to get the 3 players leave. I know it's happened a couple of times now, but even so, it's pretty telling it's only like 2 times in history, basically. So generally, I think it's pretty fair because it usually requires like some kind of cooperation between the org and the players because neither wants to lose out. But this is something I mentioned on the show I did with Richard, which I actually think personally, having seen how that it can be abused in this sense, I think that a more harsh restriction, which I think would somehow fix it, is I personally think what you do is you make it so that it's like it has to be both. So you have to have 3 players who are in that major squad. Therefore, the org can't just kick everyone out and keep the slot, but it can only be representing that team. Now, listen, not in a scenario if your contracts run out, that's different, okay? But in the situation where you're all contracted and stuff, because that way you'll never get a situation like this, where some people have been completely unprofessional, essentially fucked up the Immortals organization and rep, and now we're also going to benefit from that and say, see, yeah, we're taking the major slot away, which is, like, I do feel as though, even though that's going to be very rare, if we could cut that out at all, I think that it would be beneficial. And I think the scenario I described there, I can't think of many areas that could be abused in, and it's also been so rare that people really did move from orgs when they were contracted that I think it kind of currently solves the set of circumstances where I don't know if there would be a future scenario which would somehow mess that up.
Okay, so moving from North America and Brazil over to Eastern Europe, our buddies in Natus Vincere have had a run of pretty poor form lately since bring in Zeus, which kind of everyone thought that Zeus worked, wizardry over in Gambit, and now, he comes back to Na'Vi, he's going to fix everything, and that has not been the case at all. So again, kind of like in the SK scenario, how long do you kind of give this roster, and what do you kind of ascribe this chasm between expectations and reality to?
Yeah, so the big problem with Na'Vi is if Simple was playing worse, I'd say, okay, you've just got to fix this team and maybe the roles are wrong and maybe you need 1 or 2 players. But the way Simple is playing, he should essentially be in the final or the semi-final of every single tournament. Like, he doesn't have to do he doesn't have to get 1 more kill in each tournament, and he should already be the MVP of the tournament and potentially winning the tournament. So if you've got a player that good and you're not even making the playoffs and you're not even getting to lands and you're doing this badly, if anything, that just highlights how utterly broken every other element of the team is. Because when people try to contrast, unfortunately, the go-to reference is obviously always like Kenny S and Titan. But I always think people forget, they used to actually make the playoffs of most tournaments. They used to win a map against the team and then lose the series. This Na'Vi team doesn't do any of that. This is more like Nico and Mouse Sports. And if you remember, the laughable thing about Nico and Mouse Sports is it made sense that he was in a terrible situation because he's really good. The rest of them were average to bad players and they had no in-game leader. This team is they also are average to bad players, but in theory they have Zeus, who everyone just literally spent 3 months circle jerking over. And I don't ever use that term if you ever see my content, but what people did was just circle jerking because they didn't use any logic. They just used the logic of he left Na'Vi are shit, therefore he was the even though there'd be no Simple in Na'Vi right now without Zeus leaving. So I do think it's a bit of karma for all the people who thought Zeus was the god who was going to come and fix everything. But beyond that, this is a team that just at this point in time is not even a roster move. They probably just have to tear this entire team in half. You just say, right, we're keeping Simple, probably keeping Zeus, and then who cares? Get 3 other people at this point in time. I would literally reset the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, Flamey especially has been pretty poor of late for
and it's inexcusable, by the way, because Flamey's an example. Okay, here's the thing. This is why I don't defend Flamey. Flamey is just like Skadoodle, other players that you hit, JDM. The reason why people flame JDM, but they don't flame Skadoodle or Flamey, is because bizarrely they somehow understand that because in theory Skadoodle could be used differently and maybe be a better player, they then go, right, well, that case it's not his fault. Well, it is, isn't it? So every other player in the world is required to be self-sufficient and know how to play the game. So I agree. Guess what? If you put JDM and Flamey in different situations, they could be much better players. They could maybe be like their peak. But at the moment, they're not in teams where the guys that they're with do that, and they themselves don't seem to have any understanding of how to do that. So the big issue here is when you've got someone as good as Simple, it again shows just how off Flamey is. Because if he contributes even a bit more, they're winning some of these games outright.
No, it's funny that you brought up like NES and Titan earlier, because when I first saw like Navi getting poor results, I wanted to be like more patient with them, because that is essentially how G2 started off. You know, they were given the brand of a super team right away. The expectations were set pretty high for them, and it took some time for them to get the ball rolling. But after a while, they started like winning tournaments. But I'm starting to see that this might not be the case for Navi, because like a few days ago, like Simple tweeted, "I'm done." So that guy is like completely wrecked by now. And I saw that they are planning on going to a boot camp in a few days, and I have this gut feeling that that might be the make or break for this team, because you know we know that things can get pretty heated, especially for Navi at boot camps if things don't go as expected. So I feel like that boot camp might kind of like decide like, will this roster continue together, or is this like kind of the end for them?
Also, I think if you look at it, Navi is not a team historically in CSGO that has really benefited from boot camps. Mm-hmm. Like, if you look at them, they actually... I remember coming after they'd had the performance at ESL 1 Cologne last year, before they got Simple, where they obviously lost to Team Liquid in the quarterfinals. Right after that, it was like a week later, was when the ELEAGUE playoffs was taking place, and they were coming into that. And I remember talking to some of them, and I was thinking that they would have the logic of like, we've done a full reset, you know, we've put the major behind us, we're going to figure things out. Instead, their whole mentality was like, yeah, we'll see how this tournament goes. And then when they got wrecked by Fnatic in the semis, they were like, yeah, we're dead. This is it. See ya, bye. So they never had any sort of mental way out of it. Then you look at the fact that one of the reasons why it's so ludicrous that everyone acts as though it was, you know, written in stone that definitely Zeus was going to lead Gambit to a major is because anyone who knows the behind the scenes knows that they had one of the worst boot camps in the history of CSGO right before that tournament, where literally they also sort of were like, this team's dead, let's just play the fucking major, get the sticker money, and then just, you know, I'll leave, you'll leave, let's see who will stay, and then, you know, it's just done. So I don't really know that they're going to turn this around in that sense.
Well, if they are to turn it around, there are some bright spots in the CIS scene coming up, which has been kind of a scene that a lot of people have kind of taken shots at, specifically with the fact that they have their own minor and all that stuff, where, you know, again, speaking to your point about legend spots, how basically you've had Navi and Gambit locking up those two major spots, and then what's left below them in CIS is pretty subpar when compared to some other scenes. But we have Electronic waiting in the wings. On flip side, we have kind of this whole Kazakh scene kind of like coming out of nowhere almost. I guess they got laid new fiber or something in Kazakhstan, so these guys can play with a reasonable ping. But kind of, I mean, what do you think about that? Like, do you think that an Electronic or a Mir kind of coming on to Navi could like reinvigorate kind of that juggernaut in the CIS?
Like, I think people don't realize the sheer amount of talent there is in the CIS region. That is one of the deepest talent pools in the entire world. Mm-hmm. It's just that the problem is, and this is something that's been a tradition in Russian Counter-Strike primarily, because in the past we didn't used to really know about Kazakhstan and Ukraine for most of history. It's that those players only succeed when they are around a good leader. That's why you notice all the top teams have these classic leaders that have the same style that they run with quite often. Admittedly, Angel's the one that's most recently kind of changed his style up a bit. And so the problem is, I feel like most of those players don't get activated until they get with the right leader and they get used in the right way, or he figures out someone who can set them up or play alongside them in like a two-man game. So you have all this talent, but I would say of all the regions I've ever watched play Counter-Strike throughout all the years, that's why you need those in-game leaders, because Russian players have like a very weird individual mindset which also doesn't seem to this might sound bizarre, but they don't seem to learn very well from trial and error. So when they play a game, say they had a team where you took talents who, if you put them on Na'Vi, would be good now, but you put them all in one team on their own without a really good in-game leader, that they will have games where they hit all their shots and they'll upset. But in the other games, the normal games, as soon as a good Danish or Brazilian team, whoever it is, plays them and figures out like some pressure point and applies pressure there, it will just work the whole game and they'll just be done. That's why if you saw before Zeus went to Gambit wasn't a really good team. They were all right. They had the odd upset when, as we said, when Adren won 5 1v2s in a game or whatever, but they weren't a legitimately good team and they didn't even have a map pool. So I think that's just been the common trend throughout that region for a long time. So I think they've kind of solved it in having all the top teams have a good leader. It's just now they've got this bizarre scenario where somehow it's like the hardest region in the world to buy anyone out from.
Now, regarding leaders, looks like a few days ago or yesterday it was announced, and I saw your tweet about this as well, that looks like starix is back in the mix. So, and even though like his time on Team Spirit, it's nothing really anything worth noting, but you can't really take away what he achieved as a coach at Na'Vi. So, do you think he could possibly become that leading figure that takes one of these CIS teams to the top?
I guess what makes it tough is just the things I know about him as a person from talking to him. And that is that he is actually someone who is very stubborn. Like, here's the problem, okay? You get this happen in traditional sports, especially American sports. If you ever have like an old coach who's like a really legendary coach, this happens a lot actually at the college level. What happens is they've developed what they think is like the most efficient or effective way to play the game. They have like a whole philosophy and an offensive style, and these are all the things I want you to do. And when they take players, they just try and fit them into their system. And that is what starix is like as an in-game leader. He has his own philosophy on what he thinks is the correct way to play. And it was actually, if you look at how he used to play as an individual player, he was kind of very, very good at being a very strategical player, knowing how to play the angles and to play the smart way. The problem with that is he's got a whole bunch of players in the CIS region who don't line up with that. So I do think he could have a team where he could be a very good in-game leader or coach, but like, for example, could it be Na'Vi? I don't know about that, because I feel like actually he would be a really bad matchup with someone like Simple. I think Simple is at his best when you give him a lot of freedom and you kind of let him take the initiative, because the moves he's going to make that will be genius are objectively very bad plays for normal humans, because normal humans can't do the things that he can do. So the downside there is, like, I don't think it would work as well. Now, I will add the caveat that when he had Guardian, a lot of people might not realize this, but Guardian didn't play the way that starix wanted all the time. Like, famously, a lot of us have said to starix over the years, like, why does your team force buy so much when you have the best AWPer? And he would say, oh, that's not my choice. I tell them don't force buy, and then Guardian says, no, I want to buy a Deagle this round. So, okay, he has made accommodations in the past. It's just that I feel like if you ever looked at how that Na'Vi team played, it's not like Guardian took any pick willy-nilly and just went out by himself. No, they did still set up the whole map for him and then let him take his shots and stuff. So I just feel as though he's not the right player to be either the in-game leader or the coach of this Na'Vi squad. I don't think that's like the instant fix, Yeah,
I think for starix to have any real impact, it will have to come from the coach role, because he really was just not able to output fragging power like you need to, even in the tier 2 of the CIS level. So, I mean, he is apparently still tied to the Spirit organization, so whether he'll fill in a slot in as a coach for them will remain to be seen, but I think he should hang up his mouse for good this time, in my opinion.
And that also makes you wonder how much, like, what drive does he actually have as a player? Because I've already referenced this publicly. I can't say who, obviously, but as soon as I heard he was going to leave as the coach of Na'Vi and not be in the RV org, I contacted NA orgs and other teams that wanted coaches or wanted someone, even some of them, to be an in-game leader. They were willing to take the hit there, knowing he hasn't played in ages, because we're going to get one of the best in-game leaders in the world. And these offers were there, and for whatever reason, even though he initially told me, like, yes, I would, if the offer is good enough, I will listen. He obviously went with what, as far as I can tell, if he'd made a list, like a shopping list of all the offers, he just went to the bottom and went, I'm taking the bottom one anyway. Like, how could there have been a worse offer than that?
He could have gone to Kazakhstan, I guess, maybe.
No, he probably wouldn't have fucking major by this logic, right?
Yeah.
So that doesn't work.
What do we got next here, Blaze?
Yeah, so we were talking about the CIS scene previously, but let's just jump over quickly to the Asian scene. And this is where I want to kind of use your experience here and knowledge of like esports history here, Duncan, is that it looks like it's starting to become a trend in the Asian scene that they start importing Western players. And for example, for now, like the most obvious transfer is the one with Fates, the Estonian player, went over to China and like basically smurfed in the scene. And back when Valdi was a free agent, I saw like a tweet from one of the managers in a Asian org who said like they are looking for a CSGO player from Europe who is able to compete at the top level. So with the recent expansion of CSGO in China as well, do you think, based on what you have experienced before, that this could be a way the Asian scene will go, like just import Western players, give them a huge paycheck, and then make them just like frag out for your team?
Like the only factor that basically is at play, as far as I can tell, is how much money do the Chinese teams have. Like it's not, oh, would they consider it? They definitely would. In fact, they would do it all the time. I can tell you from League of Legends, in League of Legends, where the Chinese scene has a massive amount of money, like their streaming is fully hooked into all the esports, and basically all the streaming orgs sign like big superstar players. So it's like if you wanted to get a player, the streaming org says like, well, we'll pay part of his salary if he also streams for us. So that's how they're able to go. And in League of Legends, they would literally just go out every year and get world-class Korean players. And as a result, they literally had to make it in the Chinese League of Legends actual league that you could only have 2 Koreans at any one time, because literally every team got Koreans. Like it was ridiculous. There was about 2 that didn't. And so I know that is the mentality. They would just try and buy the players if they could. Obviously, what's going to stop them right at this moment is that even when it goes to tier 2, it's going to be hard still to lure someone to go over there, because you're not going to make a name for yourself because it's such a bad scene, you know? So I think to me, it has to be a really high dollar amount. Like if you can say, I'll pay, like if you go to Hunden and you say, I'll pay you $10,000 a month, yeah, he's probably going to go. But if you say, I'll pay you 5,000, and the difference is he can get 2,000 in Europe and stay in Denmark and be with his family, he's not going to go, is he? He's not going to consider the option. So at the moment, they're only going to be able to get the tier 2, tier 3, and that's if they've got decent money. In the future, it just depends how big CS gets. Like if CS gets big enough, I guarantee you they would sign like superstar players. They would get really big name people. And what they would do is they would offer like 3 times more money than you can get in the West. So even though not everyone would do it, some people would. A great example for me especially would be if someone was thinking about their end of their career anyway. Like the difference is, instead of Sean Gares, I guess he's not the best option because obviously you want to get married to that woman, but in theory someone like that who looks like they only want, you know, 1 more year in esports, that would be the ideal candidate. So you've got a name value, you know you're not going to play for long anyway, you go to China, you cash in for a year, you know, you try your best while you're there, but at the end of it, you know, eventually that's the end of my career.
The full Stefan Marbury, correct?
Yeah, well, basically why I asked is that for me, like we were talking about ideal candidates, and basically the whole Optic team is kind of like the players who kind of got unlucky in the past big EU roster shuffle. So what I was thinking is, like, if the money will be there, this could be like an option for people who like miss out on a good offer during a big shuffle, is that they go out to the Asian scene, get their like pockets like absolutely stacked, and then once another big shuffle happens, they just like go back and try to like get into a top European team or something.
Yeah, it also just depends on the mentality of the player. Like, as much as this may shock people who've read interviews, not every player cares about winning. Most players actually understand they will never win. Like, I realize after this last major, it seems like anything can happen. But most players who play, even if you're in like one of the better squads in your country, you'll probably never make a final in your entire career. That's just going to be the way it is, unfortunately. So there are a lot of players who actually will be cynical. Like if I had to say someone, again, he actually has a relationship, so maybe he wouldn't right now. But actually, someone like Alu is someone where I could see him just being like, "What? You'll pay me like twice as much? Yeah, I'll just go there and get the money for a year." Like certain players kind of have that mentality where they would do it. It's more how many of the, like, this is why I think some of the young players wouldn't do it. Like, I think even if you could have offered Valde a lot more, he's young and naive enough to think that he could win a major in North or something, you know, so they'll put that off. But that's also because they're young, you know, they've got a lot of time to make their mistakes.
Okay, what are we doing next, please? I don't have the thing up.
I think we're going to talk about like the whole match fixing rules revised and tournament organizers kind of like moving away from the whole Valve regulation train.
Yeah, so not super recent here, but I guess it is kind of topical because we started to see ESEA Premier start up. So we've seen, DaZeD's team GX and Steel's team Torqued kind of playing on a somewhat more consistent level. So, I mean, how do you think this is going to impact the scene as a whole? Because obviously there's a list of 20 or 30 players that now are factors again in about 66% of events, right? So specifically in North America, I would say, because we have these two full new teams that came out. So, I mean, how do you kind of see this whole thing unfolding long term?
Like the big problem is I haven't got any like investment emotionally in those squads because I don't know yet if they'll ever make it to a LAN. So I don't know if they'll ever be like truly relevant, like a DreamHack or whatever it might be. If they do, then you can start to get excited. To me, the better aspect is just that now in theory, people can actually properly start to benefit from people like Steel and DaZeD being in the scene. Like that idea that you could play in rank S with them and because they use real strats, somehow you're learning. You're not. You're just playing a pog, that you don't really take much from that. As you can see by the people who played with them, didn't seem to learn anything from them. Whereas the difference is, if those guys really are committed to being pros and they're not just being hypocritical, well, they're the ones who've complained for the last 2 years about how the NA scene is just all these young kids who don't practice properly and don't play properly. Well, if you have two more teams out there who are even vaguely good enough to get some practice, then you've got some real practice who's going to play the proper way, going to run strats. I think that's only a positive, really. I don't really see any negatives to it or any sort of downside, personally.
Do you think this was the right move from the perspective of the tournament organizers themselves? Kind of like, maybe not even in the sense of the cheating match fixing aspect, but just kind of showing some independence towards Valve, kind of how they kind of run the game, manage the game, if you will?
Oh, I absolutely think it's right. Like, one thing that tilts me is, I don't know if people are not aware of this, but I'm pretty sure I know that I heard this, I think Richard even said it on, like, the old By the Numbers, which, by the way, ended in, I think, like, May of 2016. So this is a while ago now, like, over a year ago. He referenced that when he had talked to Valve about, will you ever unban them? They'd basically said, no, but you know what? We didn't technically say that other tournaments can't unban them. And they did essentially imply that all the other tournaments that aren't Valve majors could unban them.
Right.
Now, no one did, which I thought was a shame. I hope that... First of all, I thought some of them should have just done it just for the sake of, like, having a competitive advantage. Like, if I'm Starladder or someone like that, who back then used to run, the NA tournaments as well to get you into them, I'd do it just so that you potentially have an extra little bit of reason for people to watch your stream.
Right.
Now, no one did, and I also have to say, I am mad cynical about the fact that ESL did it right after they didn't get ESL 1 Cologne as a major and haven't had a major in 2 years or whatever it is, like just over a year. So that seems a little bit like they were like, oh, well, if you're not going to play ball with us, Valve, maybe we're just going to unban those guys you banished forever. It'd be a shame if they came back. So it did seem to be a little bit of fuckery in that sense, I personally think that orgs shouldn't look to Valve in that sense anyway. I mean, if you ever looked at how Valve makes those decisions, they don't know anything about how the scene works or what to do with cheaters. They just made... I actually think it's the vacuum of not knowing what to do that made them go so harsh and think like it's literally the logic that they use in countries where they're like, cut your fucking hand off. It's like, well, no one will steal now. Well, they will. They'll just all get the hands cut off, won't they? It doesn't make any sense. So to me, I think every tournament should literally just do it on their own ethics. Like, if they think you should be banned for 2 years, then that's the rule. It's nothing to do with what Valve does, The fact that, unfortunately, people were having to think, but what will Valve think if I make a major bid? I think that's just a bad situation for everyone if you're having to start thinking along those lines,
Yeah, and I mean, I think Richard has been pretty emphatic in saying that he does not believe personally that Valve would be vindictive in that case, right? He has put it out there that he says he doesn't think that Valve consider that when handing off majors, and who can really know except for them. But no, I agree with you that I definitely thought we would see this happen much earlier than it did. I mean, we're talking almost like 3 years after the fact that it has taken some organizations to do that. And I mean, speaking of an organization that hasn't, we have WESG, who there's some licensing issue with Valve and China and the whole thing, so they kind of follow the tenet of Valve's rules, even though they don't necessarily have to. But I mean, what do you think of this event? Because obviously it's a little bit quirky. We have teams of only the same nationality playing, and it can be very hard to work around for some of these more international squads.
I actually feel like WESG got really hard done by last year, because remember, when you set these tournaments up, it's not like WESG said, oh, we'll have it a week before the major. No, that's how Valve fucking runs things, where they just give the major to someone a week after you've organised your whole event and put out an enormous prize purse. Like, remember, that was one of the biggest prize purses ever for the entire thing, and they had, the land qualifiers and all this sort of stuff. So it's actually outrageous that Valve didn't work with them and at least say, well, we'll put it 2 weeks after your LAN or something, So the WSG last year, just because it looked like a joke doesn't mean the organization's a joke and that tournament has to be a joke. It'll obviously never be like a major, because you're not going to have enough teams that have 5 players. But I hope it could at least be like a pretty cool mixed team tournament, basically what we always hoped that World Championship that EFrag used to run would be, but obviously couldn't be because eventually no one gave a fuck and they didn't even send the best players. Because what people also forget is, okay, so people remember that Godsent turned down the tournament right before, and they could have gone and represented Sweden. Well, here's what tilts me, is that if you remember the old Astralis team, the one that was Carrigan, they actually basically narrowly lost to that Godsent team, and they obviously have a 5-man Danish line, and so they might have been at that final. So there's a whole bunch of good teams might in fact have gone to that finals. Obviously the Dignitas squad could have as well, they chose not to. There was all these reasons why it could have been still a pretty fun, unique event, but with very good players and actually a couple of real teams, not just the mixed teams. So I feel like it's a good initiative. I just feel like its problem at the moment is, obviously, again, they have to hope that doesn't happen where people skip the finals, because that will ruin it. And if you've noticed, any tournament that takes a long time to run like this, you're just going to run into scheduling nightmares. People don't realize behind the scenes, it's not some coincidence that tournaments don't overlap with Pro League games now. That is literally agreements made behind the scenes and back channel handshakes, Otherwise it would be an absolute post-apocalyptic free for all where everyone was trying to wreck each other every week,
Yeah, and I do feel like, while I do think that the open circuit nature of CS, I think that it's better than kind of the ecosystem of the international. But I do think that is an area that there has to be some improvement, is kind of, at this point, everyone is just stepping on each other one way or another. And I don't know if there's a way to get rid of that entirely, but I do think it's unfortunate when you see, there's a DreamHack going on in Montreal, and then you have, Mykonos happening that same weekend, right? Basically you're just pulling viewers from both, both streams, instead of, Mykonos isn't going to get all, Montreal's not going to get all, you're going to get some here, some there. And I think that's unfortunate, especially when we have qualifiers as well clashing with these events. And that I don't think you can ever really get rid of, because you need some time to qualify, obviously. But I don't know if that could ever be fixed. We don't really have a kind of custodian or guiding force, right? Valve are basically absentee parent. So it's hard to see that ever kind of happening, really. I don't know if you have any thoughts on if that's feasible.
The only logical way I could see that you could fix it is I would do something halfway between what we have now and what they have in Dota, where in Dota they've just kind of formalized their circuit. They had a totally open circuit as well. And there was the majors for Valve, and then there was the international. So you had 2 or 3 majors in the international. All they've done now is they've got rid of their majors, and they've just made all the tier 1 events into majors, and then they pay half the prize purse, and then they have minors, which aren't actually minors in the CS terms. They're equivalent of a DreamHack Montreal, Now, what I would like is something halfway between that. So, for example, let's say at the beginning of the year, there's a Valve commissioner type guy, and what he does is he tries to do it in a fair way. He says, listen, in general, you can do what you want. If you want to just run events against each other and go head to head, that's up to you, that's competition. But I'll give each of the big orgs that I'm going to work with, let's say I'm going to work with, ESL, DreamHack, ELEAGUE, you're going to pick the ones that you think are legit, PGL, and what I'll do is, instead of being like Dota, where I'm going to put 10 majors and I'm going to dictate which they all are, I'll just say you can each have 2 events that I'll pay half the prize purse for. And my notion there is, if you're getting half the prize purse paid by Valve, and you can't then make your tournament the one that everyone goes to on that week, even if some idiot parallel schedules with you, you're probably incompetent at that point in time, because you're going to, in theory, have more prize money and a better event. So I feel like that would be it puts enough of an incentive for people not to go head to head because they're not going to steal your teams. But at the same time, you don't totally formalize the scene and give no room for creativity and no room for someone new to enter. So I kind of want something like halfway between the two.
Now, talking about teams favoring events, now another move by Valve, which was met by large criticism from the pro scene, was the whole coaching rule set. And I talked to Cuban at Cologne, and he also mentioned he talked to Valve, just why they did this, and then the big answer is like, no, we're not changing it. And do you think that's something that tournament organizers could do? Is that they actually like rework the whole coaching rule set? They sit down with the coaches, they discuss it, and then this way maybe like teams will start to favor going to their events instead, because like obviously they will be able to perform better with the coach, for example, actually being able to contribute much more in game.
Like the big problem I have with it is, in theory, again, every tournament could just do that. It could just be only, remember, there's only 2 majors a year. There could just be only 2 tournaments a year where the coach can't talk, which I think would be better. It's just that, first of all, I think it would need to be all the tournaments agreed to do it, because otherwise teams are going to actually think to themselves, it's not worth getting the benefit at this tournament if I'm sort of training myself to need that guy and then the next tournament I don't have him. So that's like an obvious reason that you'd be disincentivized to do it. And then I think if you add to that, like for teams that are the best in the world, they still are aiming for the major anyway. So unfortunately, they still might not want to do it regardless, because they might think, well, I want to train under the conditions that I would play at the major. So sadly, I think Valve probably does hold the keys on that one. Again, though, it is annoying to me that every other tournament doesn't do it. But then again, I also feel like, to tie into what I think about the top teams, I think the top teams want whatever the situation is at the Valve majors to be how it is elsewhere, so that they get into a rhythm and they're preparing for those big tournaments. So I don't think you win on that one.
All right.
Let's see. Yeah, I can't really like minimize out because I have the stream going, or the recording going.
Okay, so basically we also want to like talk about the whole ELEAGUE situation, because we know that you are on good terms with Alchemist, who was overseeing production in multiple areas, and I think Joe kind of wanted to quiz you about your thoughts on like the transfer to Overwatch League and the whole situation there.
Yeah, just the background for people who may not be as intimately aware is obviously Jason Alchemist was like a very important member of kind of early like getting CS kind of figuring out how you should watch CS and you should broadcast CS, right? And did work with Godfrag, with CPL, all that good stuff, and then kind of brought CS to TV in a way that it hadn't been done before, with Emmy Award winners and the whole deal. So to me, it reflects poorly on, I'm not going to say ELEAGUE necessarily, but on Valve, I would say, that you kind of have now let this guy go to a direct competitor and a competing product to kind of do the whole thing, basically what he's been doing for 15 years in your game, now he's going to go do that for another game. So we're just wondering kind of musings you might have on that subject that you can say.
Yeah, so this is actually like a really nuanced topic, because the key thing is he wasn't like the producer, like the head producer of the whole show. That was the guy who you're referring to, who has like all the Emmys and stuff, and I think did work on the NBA and all that sort of jazz. But he was like a producer in the sense that he controlled elements, as far as I know, to do with in-game, etc. So one of the key elements that he brought to the ELEAGUE broadcast was that he was the go-between between that head producer guy, who generally is just like, he decides the camera shots and the order they go in, and if he needs to rejig some, that guy's actually very, very talented. It's a technical talent that he has, not for the game. And Jason's job was to be the guy who figures out how you're going to show the game. And so the key part there is he was the guy sort of setting the guidelines for the observers. Now, we know the observers in their own right are good. They're actually the best we have in the game at the moment. But you still do need a producer person above them who's sort of telling them, right, on this sort of a game, I want you to set up the terrorist attack this way, or if there's a bit of extra time, let's do these shots here so we can tell a story. Because that's one of the key emphasis points that Alchemist always had to his philosophy for CS, is that it's not about catching all the frags, it's about catching the ones that tell the story of the round, And if you miss some of them, first of all, if you notice how ELEAGUE runs, they catch everything on replay anyway. So we can always show the replay if we don't get the kills. But let's set the story up properly and show like the visual aspect of the game and that way we're getting some of the tactical knowledge as well as just the flash bang fireworks of people shooting each other in the head. Now the downside there is, this is actually something where if you think about it like kind of laterally, it actually kind of shows the problem that ELEAGUE has at the moment, which is when ELEAGUE did the first 2 seasons, right? When I worked for them, for example, I was contracted both seasons from day one. Like, it was always known there would be 2 seasons. They actually, if you remember in the announcement, said that there was going to be 2 and that it was like, 1.4 million for each or whatever it was. And after that, no one knew when there would be a next one. Like, the rumors were it'll be in late spring or it'll be in summer. Well, obviously it wasn't any of those things. It was the Clash for Cash thing, which is a weird exhibition match. And then finally we got this Premier tournament, which started in September. So no one ever knew would there be CS again. And I get the sense from this move, no one knows if there will be CS again after this. Like, I think they really do go away. Like with some of the TV shows that you see, if you ever follow TV shows, unless they completely break all the viewing records, it doesn't matter how good the TV show is. Sometimes they just don't get picked up for another season, or they get cancelled halfway through. It has nothing to do with how good the product is. It's sometimes something nothing to do with you entirely. Like, for example, you might have had good enough ratings, but then they figure out this reality TV version they can do is half the money and it gets twice the viewing. So they're like, well, easy. No matter how good yours was, I have to replace you. So in that scenario, you did nothing wrong. So I get the sense from the fact that a lot of people didn't know this. This is one of the reasons I did that interview with him, because I wanted to publicize this fact. But he was not an employee of ELEAGUE.
Right, he was
didn't work for Turner. He was just a freelancer like the rest of us. And unfortunately, because you would assume he was an employee, no one ever used to come to him and say, why don't you work my event when ELEAGUE wasn't on? So he was just getting 2 gigs a year, and he was getting the worst of all worlds as a freelancer because people thought he was contracted. So if anything, the fact that they didn't contract him makes me really question what their commitment to Counter-Strike is. Because if I know for sure I'm doing 3 more years of Counter-Strike, of course I'll lock this guy up. He's worked with my whole team. It's gone really well. I know I'm going to run it eventually. This tells me they still don't know if there even is another ELEAGUE season. Then you got to add in that, it's obviously really bad that he's gone to Overwatch, a completely different game. Like, it's not like he went and got a job at ESL as the CS guy, So again, unfortunately, I would go ahead and tell you right now, I don't think Valve knows anything about who he is and what goes on with tournaments. I don't think that was ever a factor that they could have known about because they're so hands off. But it does, in that sense, even though they couldn't really have known in this sense, it now does become a factor where they have given another game some of the prime talent, and people like that are actually very thin on the ground with experience and know what they're doing.
No, I just think it's unfortunate because he's done so much kind of, he was there at the beginning, took a break, and now he came back and he has really done great work with ELEAGUE, and as well as at the ELEAGUE Major. And I think I get the sense with the ELEAGUE that they're trying to appeal to, like, they want to build the ELEAGUE brand, not necessarily the ELEAGUE Counter-Strike brand, right? So you see.
Well, if you've noticed, even when they did those first seasons, they went, so in the first season, all they'd ever done was CS. Remember, they eventually did the Overwatch in the second season, but they would always say repeatedly in all the interviews, like, that they might do other games, and ELEAGUE's not just CS. Like, they were never 100% in on CS from day one anyway. And I think it's a bad sign if you ever look at the fact that, bear in mind, it's all great for us if the major has like 1 million viewers or whatever, but really all they care about is how many were on TBS. That is their only actual way to make money. And if you ever look, the Street Fighter weeks got the same or more viewers than CS sometimes. So unfortunately, I can't even blame them if they feel as though they can switch any game in and out, because they have thus far and it's worked.
Right. Moving on.
Yeah, so basically we are going to start wrapping it up probably, because we know it's late for everyone here. Regarding you, Thorin, is there anything you can talk about any projects or events you will be working on that we might find interesting?
It's not really, when I say this, I'm not making, this isn't like my magnum opus or something that I want to be remembered for with my legacy, but I actually have been brainstorming recently where what I want to do is, where before I used to do those episodes of Thorin versus Reddit where I just pick stupid comments and I wreck them, I'm going to expand that brand. So essentially it's like Thorin versus everything, and then I just what I have to do is, it's going to take a long time to do this because obviously with the other ones I just pick X amount of stupid Reddit comments and I find good answers to it. For this one it needs to be different areas, so it'll be for example, when people flame me, I'll try and find the worst the most brutal hardcore shit where they just wreck at me completely, and I'll just be going straight back at those motherfuckers. So there'll be those ones. I'm going to try and make it like some of them are going to be really unique. Like I won't give away too many hints, but there'll be some that'll be like, okay, you remember when I did that reflections with myself? There'll be some that are almost as indulgent as that. That's all I'm going to say.
All right, so it looks like we're going to like get a lot of entertaining.
More. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not necessarily the highest quality analysis or anything.
Right. Do you have any events coming up on the calendar that you can speak to, or probably not, right?
No, at the moment I don't really have anything lined up. Like October's pretty barren anyway. There's not a whole lot going on this month because obviously it's like ELEAGUE's basically it, and then I think. Let me think. What is it that's towards the end? I think there's like a DreamHack at the end of the month or something like that.
Epicenter, I think. Epicenter will
that's
be,
right.
Yeah.
I haven't got the best relationship with Russians, so I'm hoping to keep that.
or Brazilians, or Poles, or the list grows.
None of the really good countries that you notice. Fucking killing it with all the good ones. Got an O1A visa to come into America, mate. So
that's
all the ones that matter. I've got those locked down.
So I guess before we go, let's just talk about so obviously your services and talents are in demand from all these events that aren't in the bad countries that you don't want to go to. So aside from events happening in countries that you don't want to go to, how do you kind of pick through the various offers that you might have that might conflict?
So actually, yeah, that's actually a good topic because this year I took a very different approach to the past. So what I used to do was, in the first couple of years of CSGO, I used to essentially do almost everything. Like if someone asked me to work with them, especially if they were a new org actually, I always used to work with them. And initially, because I wanted to make it so that my brand was really big and I in theory had connections with everyone, so then I could pick and choose, I actually used to also, the first time I worked with someone, quote a very, very reasonable rate so that I knew that I would get the gig and it was all squared away. And then the idea was I would do the event, they would see that they liked what I had to offer, they'd see what it brought to the broadcast, and then you can negotiate something higher and go towards the top tier rates, etc. But because 2015 and 2016, the sheer amount of work days I did, it was just wrecking me too much. Like it really started to take a massive impact on the other stuff I was doing. And I mean, I'm lucky enough to be in a position where that's not actually my main source of income. So it's great to be able to be at all the big events, but if it was starting to impact not only like my life, like I didn't have that many days off, but also wrecking the other side of my work, so I was getting really strained with all the videos and stuff, which is where I make most of my money, then in that scenario, I already was thinking to myself, like, I have to cut some of these down. So my way of cutting down this year, I admit, might not have been the best strategy, because what I did was, this year, I essentially just did all the highest paying gigs that I got offered. And so what will seem bizarre to people about that is that I haven't done as many of the tier 1 events. Like, it might sound counterintuitive, but I got paid more to do the PGL EU minor than I would have gotten paid to do some events that are like tier 1. Because that's just the way some of the organizations, some of them don't have as much budget, or some of them try to get a bit greedy and get every tier 1 talent, so not everyone's going to get paid the maximum rate, So I took that approach. I have to say, after doing that, it was a little bit hollow, I have to say, because there were some events where, like, every now and then you can do an event that's only like half the good teams or just some of the lower teams. You can do that every now and then as like a bit of variety. But if you do too many of those, it does kind of grate a little bit. You do start thinking, I am kind of doing this for the money, really, right? I'm not really doing it just because it's a great event. And plus, there would be sometimes those big tier 1 events where I'd turn them down, but I would be watching it at home like everyone else, and I would go, actually, I'd like to have been there, even if it was a little bit of a cut compared to what I would have made at this other event, So I feel like I've got to get a better balance on that. I'm definitely not going to do as many events. Like this year, I've done a lot less than I did in the past. I'm going to continue to keep it reasonable, but I will probably essentially just give up some money to do some of the better events. I'll do like a more of a half and half split. There was also, just as a final note, I did also play hardball with a couple of orgs. So part of the reason why you didn't see me at certain events, I won't list the events obviously, is because they contacted me too late. And some of them I even contacted and said, would you like me to work this event in 3 months? They never got back to me. And then, 2 weeks out from the event, they were like, would you like to work this event? I'd say, no, actually, since he never contacted me, I've already booked, to go and see a concert on that day, or I've got a holiday done. So I even though I would make the money, it would be, in theory, it'd be worth throwing the holiday away. It's not going to match up to how much you get paid. But in those scenarios, I decided I would play hardball, kind of teach them a lesson and say, oh, really sorry, but I'm unavailable on those dates. I'd love to work with you next time. So let's improve our communication with each other. Maybe I missed your email or so, just some bullshit like that. And so I think I sent them, I think the message got through to some of them. So we'll see. I think everything will resolve itself going on from here.
So
except for Russians and Brazilians and Poles, of course. In which case, they know where we both stand on that.
So, in closing, life lessons from Thorin's: money isn't everything, and check your emails, I guess. So that wraps it up, I guess, for episode 1 or episode 0 of Draulon and Joe Talk CSGO. Thanks to both of you guys for being flexible and recording at midnight or beyond your time. Special thanks to Thorin for dedicating some time to help us with this. And Twitters are right there on the bottom. Give us all follows. Thorin and I roast people on Twitter sometimes. Draulon is a lot nicer, so if you want a safe space, you can go follow him. All right, thanks guys. Stay tuned for more.